Hello, my name is Dr. Laura Morreale. I'm a medieval historian who lives and works here in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Carrie Beneš. I teach medieval and Renaissance history here in Sarasota, Florida at New College of Florida.
And one of the research interests that Dr. Beneš and I share is the study of medieval Italian historiography. That is, the ways inhabitants of the Italian peninsula wrote stories about themselves and their communities in the medieval period, starting in around the 10th century and extending to the 15th century or a little thereafter. Now, there are many different terms used for the sources that both Dr. Beneš and I have studied, and these include town chronicles, municipal histories, urban chronicles, but today we've settled on the term civic chronicles, and Dr. Beneš will speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, Dr. Beneš has done more work on historical works written in Latin than I have, but I've done a certain amount of work on histories written in languages other than Latin. So we're going to let Dr. Beneš start with that, and then I'll come in just a bit.
Okay, so historical writing in the Middle Ages, as you may know, is typically divided by scholars today into chronicles and annals. Chronicles come traditionally out of the Greco-Roman tradition. These are historical narratives based on scholars like Livy, Eusebius, Jerome, Paul the Deacon, and so on and so forth. Whereas annals come much more out of a functional tradition where monks usually, but people in the Middle Ages actually started making notes on Easter tables. Easter tables were trackings of years whereby to help you calculate the date of Easter, which changed every year. And sometimes they would make little notes on particular years, like this is the year that King William died, or in this year there was a great earthquake. So chronicles and annals are generally understood to have these very different origins, and also to have very different, therefore, forms. Chronicles tend to be more discursive, whereas annals tend to be much more just kind of notations of events. Either way, most historical writing in the early Middle Ages, number one, had a universal focus, so starting in creation and then going kind of year by year or age by age up to the present moment. And also, two, tended to be written by members of the church. Starting as early as the 10th or 11th century, however, it's quite clear that the writing coming out of Italy was different from elsewhere in Europe. Now, some of it was traditional universal chronicles written by clerics, often like the continuators of Paul the Deacon. So you would take a chronicle that started at creation, and then you would just keep going where it left off. But another big difference is that a lot of it is much more, it's not universal, it's much more focused on the city. And we generally explain this by saying, well, look, Italy was much, much more urbanized than the rest of Europe in this time period. So the city was much more of a core unit of social identity and social expression. In particular, much of this historical writing was also written by laymen rather than clerics, that is, not priests, not monks. And I use the word laymen intentionally there, most of them were men. This was due to higher levels of literacy generally, but it's also important to recognize here, I think, the very important social role played by notaries in medieval Italian cities. So notaries were legal professionals on a very mundane level. They recorded contracts, they kept track of statutes in the cities, but they also served as archivists and historians. So there's two different things going on here. One is notaries' role as keepers of writing as authentication, right? Keepers of the truth, the notion that if something is written down, like a statute or a historical narrative, it must be true. The other thing is that notaries often also functioned in these cities as teachers of children and young people, traditionally, particularly young men. And so therefore they were familiar with the Greco-Roman chronicle tradition or historical tradition. They had read works like Livy. Now, these trends, urbanization, lay culture, lay literacy, and the important role of notaries, they all coalesce into this genre that we now call the civic chronicle. This is a history, a historical narrative viewed through the lens of the city, usually written in that city by an inhabitant of that city. It is chiefly about the city. Some of these, usually the earlier ones, are more analytic. They tend to start in medias res, like, right, they just jump into, okay, 1098, we joined the crusade. And they tend to be more like recitations of factual events. The various different Lombard annals, or annals of the Lombard cities, which start to appear in the 11th century, of Milan, of Bergamo, of Cremona, and so on and so forth, tend to be like this. Some of them, by contrast, are much more consciously rhetorical. So they'll start with creation, they have a kind of a literary or scholarly framing. Those tend to be more common starting in the 13th century. But all of this historical writing comes together to create an important genre that expresses what we call the civic consciousness of Italians in this period. That is their sense of community that's focused on the city, their shared history and experience within that city, which really demonstrates their sense of the city as the basic socio-political unit. I mean, there are emperors, there are kings that appear in these chronicles, but they are generally external actors. So I wanted to give you the example of Genoa, because Genoa is interesting in that you get both of these kinds of historical writing over the course of its heyday as one of the great entrepôts of the medieval Mediterranean. The Genoese historical tradition starts with the writing of a Genoese man called Caffaro di Castiglione, who started writing his chronicle in 1101 as the Genoese, number one, formed their first commune, and number two, sent off a fleet to join the First Crusade. And the fact that all of these things coalesce together is not considered to be a coincidence. And so Caffaro, who was both one of the city's first consuls, that is, executive magistrates, and also went on several of their crusading efforts, started writing very much in the middle of things. Here we are in Genoa at the very beginning of the 12th century, and he just starts writing, and he keeps writing. And about 50 years later, the city council of Genoa said, well, gosh, this is really, really great, and we should make it into the official chronicle of Genoese deeds, right? The official chronicle of the commune of Genoa. And so they basically adopted it, and they made one official manuscript, and they appointed official historians or official chroniclers and archivists to keep it going. And the Genoese annals, as we now call them, start with Caffaro, and they go all the way up to 1293, when they end for reasons that scholars still aren't really clear on. And there's a whole, the annals are edited or written by a bunch of different Genoese official chroniclers in turn, and some of them are better and some of them are worse. And they mostly just sort of say, well, okay, in this year the Genoese did this and this other thing happened, and so on and so forth. It sounds very factual, although there's been a lot of interesting research done recently on how actually kind of almost subtextually polemical or rhetorical they are. So those are the Genoese annals on the one side of things. On the other side of things, I recently translated for the Manchester Medieval Sources series the Chronicle of Genoa by Jacopo de Voragine, who was Archbishop of Genoa in the 1290s. He's better known, much, much better known for having written the Golden Legend, which is one of the great collections of saints' lives of the Middle Ages. But he actually wrote a lot of different things, including over 700 sermons. He was very prolific. And he wrote a Chronicle of Genoa in the 1290s at the very end of his life when he was Archbishop. And that Chronicle of Genoa is very unlike the Genoese annals in that it's much more structured, it's much more consciously literary, it's much more all-encompassing. He actually says in the first book of the history, now because the annals, the previous histories of Genoa, don't go as far back as the foundation of the city, I have done some digging and I'm going to go back and tell you about what I know about the foundation of Genoa. Because he thought it was very important in this kind of full history to go back and do that. So that gives you just a sense of how the annals and the history are different. And we see this a lot in lots of different histories written in Latin, but by laymen, in Italy through the 12th and the 13th centuries. There are lots and lots of other examples, some of them from larger cities, places like Milan, Venice, and Pisa. There are also lots of others, both annals and histories from smaller cities, places like Piacenza, Ferrara, Cremona, and Todi, places that, you know, undergraduates often haven't heard of, places that may have had maybe 15 or 20,000 inhabitants at the time, so relatively small. What is interesting is everyone always says, well, what about Florence? Florence is interesting because there are no Latinate chronicles, and there's basically nothing from before the 14th century. Florence really only comes into the picture when we get into the vernacular chronicles. By the 14th century, vernacular chronicles in Italian or other languages are increasingly common, but the Latin tradition, I think it's important to note, does continue. So for example, Andrea Dandolo, a great Venetian historian, wrote several different chronicles and histories of Venice in the mid-14th century. But now I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Morreale to talk about the vernacular tradition.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, Florence did come back with a vengeance in the 14th century. There's a number that, there are more vernacular histories of Florence, written than almost any, the total of any other cities in Italy during this time. So they really come back and are quite chatty about their history. Well, I'm going to just mention that Italians started writing the stories of their towns in languages other than Latin, beginning in about the middle of the 13th century. That's sort of the end of the 13th century, middle to the end. And there are many reasons why they would choose to do that, some having to do with the competencies of the authors, others with the interests of those who they wanted to read their work. Now, it's important to remember, as Dr. Beneš has mentioned, that at this time, Italy was a relatively literate place, certainly compared with many other locales in Europe. So there were writers and there were readers who were ready and who were really eager for this new kind of narrative in the vernacular, and who were ready to identify closely with the towns in which they lived. Now, one of the earliest vernacular historians writing in the Italian peninsula, perhaps the earliest, is the Venetian Martin da Canale, or Martino da Canale, depending on which language that you're speaking. And he began his work, Les Histoires de Venise, which might be translated as The Deeds of the Venetians, in 1267. Now, you'll notice that that did not sound like Italian. What's very interesting about this work is that da Canale chose to write it in a kind of Old French, rather than in Latin or the local vernacular, and he tells us why. He says it's because French was the language that ran throughout the world. Those were his words. Da Canale's history began with the founding of the city of Venice. It provided a view on a few very important events in the town's history, including quite a biased account of Venice's participation in the infamous Fourth Crusade. And then it finished up with a recounting of the events of Da Canale's own time, ending in the year 1275, which is when we believe that Da Canale actually died. So the excerpt that we have linked to in this post is from that later section, and it's really great. It describes in quite lengthy detail a procession of the town's guilds during a celebration for the installation of a new doge, which is the Venetian word for duke. Aside from the amazing description of clothing and the rich items that are being carried around, what I think is really interesting about this excerpt is that the guilds were in fact making their way to pay their respects to the dogaressa, right, the wife of the doge, who was understood at this point to be the protector of the guilds in Venice. So it's quite a different perspective than one might expect. Now, perhaps the most influential Italian language writer of a civic chronicle in the medieval period in Italy was Giovanni Villani, who wrote his Cronica Nuova, or New Chronicle, of the city of Florence, starting in around 1320. So that's about a generation after Da Canale was writing. Villani was a banker. He came from Florence's merchant class. So he was really attuned to the desire of this class for a historical narrative that was far more comprehensive in terms of subject matter than just a story of their town. I mean, these were relatively cosmopolitan people. The Chronica is far-ranging in its scope. It addresses matters well beyond Florence and into the Italian peninsula. and it covers affairs in other parts of Europe, well into the Latin East. Villani was also very interested in using statistical information as a banker and a merchant, and quantitative materials, and you'll see that in the link, the excerpt that we have linked here. Now, Villani's work was so popular with his audience that parts of it were excerpted and then inserted into civic chronicles in other towns. The most well-known of this is the Chronicle de Partenope, which was written in Naples, also about a generation after Villani. But civic chroniclers throughout Italy, and even in places as far away as England, came to rely on Villani as a source for their own histories. Now, as you read through these civic chronicles, both the ones that were first written in Latin and those that were written in the vernacular, I really hope that you're able to think about the effort that was put in by these medieval historians and the strategies they used to both reflect what was going on in their towns, but also to shape these identities, right? To shape the identities of their fellow townspeople, and have them really think about the communities to which they belonged. They're really wonderful and rich sources, and I hope that you are as enthusiastic about them as Dr. Beneš and I are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.